And I guess that's, as you're speaking there, what keeps coming to me is this idea of community and this idea of the Mankind Project that, we connected through Bill Kauth, who set up the Mankind Project. I found in my work that I first initiated in 2016. And since then, before it felt like I was doing work, but it was a bit on my own. Now it feels like I had a meeting with 3 MKP. There was 2 other MKP men this morning about doing this film about the impact of boarding school. When I said I was writing a book about my boarding school experience, a MKP man stepped forward, and they're doing all of these wonderful projects. It feels like, as you've mentioned before about the importance of community transition towns, it almost feels that's, I'm seeing in my own work, that's partly the solution, that I'm not doing this on my own. And I see certainly a lot of us feel very isolated. And that's what I love, something about the Mankind Project or Transition Town. I was involved in the Transition Town in Hebden for about a year. It didn't really take off in Hebden Bridge. But I think the first meeting we had probably 60 to 100 people sat in a circle, and we had all the different groups. But that idea of community. So I'd love you to speak a little bit, and maybe that's, I realize we're kind of moving on in time a bit, this idea of where we're going. How do we survive the future? If we're going into this economic collapse, if we're going into these issues, how do we survive?
Yeah, there's a line in David Fleming's writing, because he's a very, very pithy writer in many ways. Someone described reading his book as feeling like the writer was winking at them the whole way through. And he has this line, do nothing that matters without consulting a conversation. And in many ways, for me, that's the root of community in the broadest sense. And some people find that in, I don't know, the online communities, social media, whatever. But I think there's something more humanly nourishing about connecting with real humans, and ideally face to face. I feel the absence in this conversation of, I would much rather be sitting in the Happy Pig, our little free pub just over there, and chatting about this, and other people might wander in and drift away and be part of that. And I think the further we get from that, the less it feels communal, and the less it feels human, and the less it feels nourishing. But I do think the fundamental yearning, fundamental need is there. And one of the core, largely unspoken teachings of the culture I grew up in is that, all the important questions are questions for me to answer as an individual. What do you want to do with your life? What inspires you? What excites you? Even philosophically, existentialism was this whole idea that there is no preset meaning, there's no God-given meaning. It's just we exist, and then we determine what the essence of our existence is. And I think in many ways that's a beautiful idea, but our culture has assumed that the we who decides what is the individual. It never doesn't even occur to people that it might be a collective answer. Like, what do we want to be? We. And so it's interesting, we find that community in a lot of places. And I think one thing that the kind of social media machine has done horrifically brilliantly is tap into that yearning for conversation and collective, and sort of pervert it into something that becomes this mass surveillance machine that allows them to sell us capitalist products more effectively. And it's interesting to me. So the Mankind project that you mentioned didn't particularly connect for me. I encountered it and went to some events and just, didn't particularly grab me in the same way that you encountered Transition and went to some events and, just didn't quite click. But I think all of these efforts are essential because they're different ways of engaging with that drive for community that will click for different people and in different places. And again, large-scale problems do not require large-scale solutions. It's not here's the answer. It's how do we create a framework within which a whole diversity of appropriate answers can emerge for different individuals and different localities. And that's the principle that underpins everything I do, really. The Transition Towns, it's about how do we create a framework that encourages local communities to figure out what they need and to do it. I used to chair a thing called the Ecological Land Co-operative, which is all about like how do we allow people who want to lovingly manage a piece of land to access that land and do so affordably and not have to engage with all the madness of the planning permission system. Because the local solution that we need is for each piece of land to be managed by someone who loves and is in touch with that piece of land. It's not for government to decide what should be done with every piece of the land centrally. And the Happy Pig here is a whole other story. It's this place where people can come and stay for free and no money changes hands, and it's a place where people can exist outside of the market economy. But again, what that means to people will look very different, and the way that people engage with that does look very different. But again, it's a framework that makes it possible for people to find what they need. The online courses that I currently run through Stirling College, again, it's a framework for all the people who join to find their calling and their path and hopefully their desires for cultural revolution. And so for me, community is the crucible where that happens. It's the place where we can start to recognize that there's something fundamentally unsatisfying about just making decisions based on our own personal whims. And that, while our culture tends to sort of fetishize freedom, we don't really ever ask very much what freedom means. And again, that means it's very easily co-opted as a concept. So I think it was George H.W. Bush, who said, we know what we stand for. We stand for freedom, like free speech, free markets, free democracy. And you're like, well, actually, I don't think America stands for any of those things. And actually, those things aren't even necessarily compatible with each other. They're all deeply different senses of the word free. And yet, almost nobody will ever stand up and say, I'm against freedom. It's like this sacred cow, right? But if there are different senses of freedom that work against each other, like, for example, the freedom to do whatever you want is directly opposed often to other people's freedom to not have things imposed on them by you. They're both clearly freedoms, but there's a tension between them. And you can't just say, well, I support freedom. You're just ignoring the question if you say that. And so, we often feel this longing for freedom that's real. But there's a line in a Johnny Cash song, actually, freedom, freedom. Your freedom's just walking this world all alone. And, at some point, if we're going to do anything or commit to anything, well, that's a relinquishing of a freedom to walk all the other paths that we could have walked. But just to exist as potential and never actualize anything isn't very satisfying either. And the path to finding commitments that bring us love and joy and satisfaction that we look back on and think, oh, I did that, we did that. Well, that's community, that's working with others, that's figuring out. And like for me personally, like I never enjoyed the kind of company structure, working in an office and having a boss, and like that never felt nourishing to me at all. And you know, stepping away from that learning center all those years ago was in part that as well. It was like, well, can I work out a way of existing that doesn't feel like it's part of that system? And the answer, as it's turned out, has been yes. You know, I'm not in that space, and it's only been possible in community, you know, in various communities, but currently in this little co-housing space that we created here over recent years. And so, yeah, I suppose for me, community is the key to a life well lived. And engaging with it relative to the current dominant culture is a kind of revolutionary action. You know, in a world where it's just a given that, you know, what really matters is the individual and individual rights and individual life, and to find the joy that comes in binding yourself to others, which largely we're only ever meant to do romantically, according to the kind of, you know, dominant culture. Yeah, it's joyous and it's good and it's revolutionary.
Thank you. So what I'm hearing here is, like, surviving the future, one of the key aspects is community. What other things are important? I mean, obviously that's probably a separate conversation, and maybe that's more, if people are interested in exploring that, I'll put some links to the Transition Town website so people can have a look more at that. Or if you've got any other ideas, well, how do we start to create community? I mean, I lived in a community for 3.5 years, and my God, was it hard work on one level, but it was beautiful on another. I know. And again, I've been involved in Menfest the last few years down in Devon, which is a little men's festival, no drink or drug. But we've been discussing some really difficult topics about Black Lives Matter, or, you know, transgender, or in a community where we could just, well, we have differing views and everyone being heard, rather than you're right, I'm wrong.
Right. And in many ways, in one of our guest teachers on the recent course said, the crisis that we face is fundamentally a crisis of relating. And the more I think about that, the more true it is, whether that's relating to other humans, whether that's relating to the natural world, whether that's relating to our stories of what's important. And I do think that this polarization in mainstream culture is one of the key, not the key, issues that we face. It's related to social media, as we mentioned earlier, this sense by which social media creates these kind of filter bubbles where you tend to just be constantly fed more things that agree with you, and so you get the impression that everyone else agrees with you, and then it's horrific when you encounter some crazy person who doesn't agree with you. And yeah, I mean, and as you say, community is the crucible for resistance to that. I mean, in the online sense of community, you know, on our last course, we had several people who felt very strongly about both sides of the vaccination issue, for example. And it was a healing thing for everyone involved to be able to look at each other and say, well, I can completely understand why during a lethal pandemic people might be interested in getting a vaccine. I can completely understand why people might not trust the motivations of big pharma. I can completely understand why, as easily infectious disease spreads, people might think it's a good idea to restrict people's movements. I can completely understand why people might be worried about the civil liberties implications of that. Like, there's nothing particularly surprising about any of those viewpoints, and I share them all. The question is, in practice, how are we going to balance these different very appropriate impulses. And the only time that really becomes a fundamental problem is if you suddenly go, well, people who hold views 1 and 3 are in this tribe, and people who hold views 2 and 4 are in that tribe, and we're just going to split apart and lob insults at each other, which is such a clearly dysfunctional approach to what's just, you know, a decision that we need to collectively make about how we're going to deal with a situation that's arisen. And yes, you know, community is where that happens, and community is consequently again a key to kind of a healing that our culture is desperately in need of. But then you ask about, well, what else, you know, besides community? And I think, well, I think it would be fair to characterize the last few hundred years of Western development as being a gradual dismantling of community, a gradual moving towards atomization and individualism. And so the question is, well, what made that possible? Like, what have we relied on instead of community? And I think the answer is money, in short. You know, like, money is the way that we relate to each other. Like, if I've got money, I can just turn up in a place where I don't know anybody and I can get what I need, because I just pay for it. And in some ways, you know, that's great. You know, like, I know sometimes there have been times, say I'm invited to give a talk in a particular community, and I know someone there, but I haven't spoken to them in 5 years. And, you know, I could contact them and see whether I could stay the night and, you know, do that. Or I could buy a hotel room, you know, or stay in a B&B or whatever. And there's definitely a temptation to do the latter. You feel like, well, you know, it's going to be a lot of time and effort and socializing, and I'd rather just be in my own space and get on with my own stuff. And so, you know, it's easy to see the kind of allure of that kind of individualized, financialized way of existence. And the fundamental thing that I think most people haven't appreciated yet is that the choice is not between those two things. The choice is not between continuing with our financialized existence or community, because that money-based way of life is ending. Like, we all know that society's current way of life is unsustainable, but we seem to forget that means it's going to end, even though that's literally what the word means. And I mean, you don't have to go too far to talk to people who've lived through hyperinflation, for example. You know, there were people on our course which attracts people from all over the world who were talking about being paid and literally running down the street to the shop to spend their money before it became worthless, because you know, that was how quickly their currency was devaluing with hyperinflation. You know, there are plenty of people in the world who know about the situation of suddenly all bank accounts being locked and you know, people not being able to withdraw their money. There are, you know, national currencies are intrinsically tied into this kind of global casino of speculation and trading, by which, I mean, we see things that we think of as normal, like currency exchange rate fluctuations. I mean, what is that? Like, what is that? I mean, like, it's hilarious if you go to change cash and you watch the rates change for a while, and you think, okay, so if I change my money right now, I'd get $200 US, and then you wait half an hour and you're like, okay, if I change my money right now, I'd get $195 US. Oh, if I change it right now, I'll get $210 US. Okay, I'll change it now, and you get 200. And you think, well, where did this $10 come from? Like, it's just appeared out of thin air. It just really brings home like how illusory, and yet I can take it to a shop and I can buy something with it. I can get like physical, real objects in exchange for that $10. And that might feel great. You're like, oh yeah, I got a good deal on the currency exchange, and now I can go and buy something with my $10. But if you just look at the inverse of that and think, well, if that can just appear out of thin air that easily, well, it can disappear into thin air just as easily. And, you know, people who understand this system deeply have been telling us for some time that this thing is also unsustainable in all its own ways. It's, you know, a Ponzi scheme, as they say. And what my culture taught me was, well, the way to look for security in my future is, you know, to have a pension and, you know, buy a house and look for that kind of financial security. And I am entirely convinced that that is not a good place to look for security for ourselves and our families and our communities. This system is in a whole lot of ways based on foundations that are crumbling. The financial foundations of the system are crumbling. The ecological foundations that underpin all value in the world are crumbling. The cultural foundations are crumbling. This is not the place to look for security. So where is the place to look for security? Well, I would say, and this is really what David Fleming's work was a study of. I mean, he was a historian, and later became an economist to study all the things that were mad about economics.
And he did a PhD just to learn about economics. God.
Well, he did, yeah. Like he was sort of advocating that we need to fundamentally change the route, and his friend Jonathan said to him, well, we need to learn the language of economics to meet these arguments on their own ground. And so, yeah, he went away and got a PhD in economics so he could do that. But he was like, well, okay, if the financial economy is collapsing, like, and sure, there are a bunch of things we could hypothetically do to avoid that, but we all know we're not going to, because we've been campaigning on that for decades and nobody's listening. What was thriving based on before this brief period of madness? Because, I mean, money itself has only existed about 5,000 years. The kind of growth-based market economy has existed a few hundred years. Humanity, like Homo sapiens, like modern, anatomically modern humans, existed for 300,000 years. I mean, you know, 300 years is a blip. It's 0.1% of human history. And yet it's been around just long enough that we and our grandparents don't really remember what happened before it. And as David wrote, like, if we don't know anything about history, then our expectations are just a product of how we live today. And I think that's a real widespread disease in our culture. That, well, this must be normal, right? Because this is what's been here my whole life and my parents' whole life. It's the most abnormal period in the whole of human history. And it's, for anyone who isn't determined to believe that it will continue, the signs are overwhelming that it ain't. And so it's very natural then to say, well, how did people thrive before it? Because we might be able to learn something from that. And the essential conclusion, to boil down, you know, a vast bunch of work in David's dictionary, is that in the absence of primarily relying on money for our security, the two things that we rely on are, firstly, the natural world, the ecology, as I say, the foundation of all value, the thing that produces all our food and water and oxygen when it comes down to it. So the ecology, and yes, community, actually, people relating to each other and caring about each other. And one of the most toxic kind of myths or beliefs at the heart of our culture, I think, is this idea that, you know, your primary responsibility, like before anything else, the thing you absolutely non-negotiably ethically must do is become financially independent. If you're not financially independent, you're a sponge, you're a parasite, you know. You should be ashamed of yourself, and you probably are. You know, you probably don't want to tell your parents about it. You probably don't want to admit it to your friends, because our culture is very clear. You should be ashamed of yourself. And that is absolutely key, I think, to our future, is challenging that idea, because I would argue that not only is financial independence a deeply misguided thing to aim for, it actually doesn't even exist. Because even, say you're a billionaire
mm,
you're not independent. Someone else still grew your food. Someone else still built your house. Someone else still delivers all the services that you need. You're not independent. All that money allows you to do is to depend on people you don't know instead of depending on people you do know.
mm, mm, mm.
And it's lonely as all hell
Yeah.
because everyone in your life is replaceable.
Yeah.
If they don't deliver what you want, I'll just buy it from someone else.
Mm.
Everyone in your life is replaceable. Everyone in your life knows they're replaceable and so is being very nice to you in order to not be replaced. I mean, of course it's miserable. Like, you don't need anyone. Nobody really needs you in any sense other than your money. And so everyone that wants to get close to you, you're like, well, hang on, do you care about me or just the money? Of course it's miserable. And yet that place, that miserable, isolated, atomized place is what almost everyone in our culture gives the majority of the best years of their life to trying to achieve financial independence.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we wonder why everyone feels hollow, why everyone feels dissatisfied. And it's this mad thing. Like, when I talk about cultural revolution, like, this is the nub of it. Like, we live in a time when all the polls and things that people do, they say people feel this real absence of meaning. Like, what's the point? What's the point of it all? Why am I even bothering to get up and go to work in the morning? At the same time as the greatest crises of civilization are unfolding, at the same time as we're absolutely destabilizing the future of life on Earth, what could be more meaningful? So we've got this incredible unfolding reality that desperately needs more people to engage with it and could be the most meaningful work anyone's ever done in their life.
Yeah.
And almost everyone's sitting around going, oh, I just can't find anything worth doing. That's how misguided our culture is. And that makes people so miserable that they then get into, I don't know, drinking or drugs or watching Love Island or whatever it is to distract themselves from how empty it all feels.
Yeah. Yeah. Could it be that sometimes it seems too big? It's like, and therefore, a bit like I've heard that from, I'm a scout leader for teenagers, and I'm hearing from people that it's like, well, there's no hope for that. As you said, there's no hope for these guys. There's going to be nothing there. What I try and tell them is, actually, I feel it's the most exciting time to be around on one level, because I really feel things are going to change in a positive way. But I do feel, is it that it's too big a dream or too big a problem? But like you said, I think I've heard on a podcast, you said either people with the environment, they can recycle or campaign against their MP, or there's this huge problem. It's like, and I've heard you speak about this middle way. Is it that we need to be telling people, find your middle way? What can you do?
Well, yeah, you said a lot of interesting things there, and I was just making notes so I didn't forget some of them.
Like, I've got pages.
I mean, I always find it really frustrating. Like, as a teenager, I don't know if kids at school are still being told this, but I was always told, dream big, whatever you want to do, you can achieve it. It's really important. Never give up on your dreams. And then I'd say, well, I dream of not destroying the future of life on Earth. I don't dream of scoring the winning goal in the FA Cup final, or making £1 million, which are the culturally approved dreams. And the response tended to be like, oh, well, don't dream that big. Like it's like how capitalists are always going on about innovation, right? Like, oh, we have to stimulate innovation and we have to give people freedom so that they can innovate and generate wealth and generate jobs. But we're not allowed to innovate when it comes to capitalism. We're not allowed to innovate when it comes to like the fundamental, what's important in our culture. No, then there is no alternative, right? This is just how it is, and you've got to accept it and don't be a crazy wild-eyed dreamer. It's very interesting, this kind of dream big but only within these very prescribed boundaries. And I think that when people look at something like climate change and think, well, that's just too big, I can't do anything about that. I think that's completely appropriate. I think that if there is a problem that's so vast that you can't make any meaningful contribution to it, then it's completely appropriate to refocus your attention on things that you can make a meaningful contribution to and get on with doing something useful at that level. So yeah, I would kind of, in a way, stand up for that that position. And like, you know, you say you believe that things are going to change in a positive way. I believe that things are going to change in a negative way. In fact, I believe they are doing. I think that our civilization is collapsing. I think that our climate is being destabilized in a way that it's too late to head off. I believe that all these species that are going extinct every day are not miraculously going to come back to life. I believe that our financial system is going to collapse, and most people are going to be wildly unprepared for that. So yeah, I think that things are going to change in a whole lot of very negative ways. And as you mentioned at the start, my work goes under this name of dark optimism. I mean, I get really frustrated with bright, shiny optimism. You know, I'm like, well, everything isn't fine. Like, everything really isn't fine. And, you know, if someone's all bright, shiny at me, I feel the need to, you know, confront them with some facts. At the same time, if someone's looking at those facts and just feeling despair and overwhelm, well, then I want to say, yeah, like, you're right, this probably isn't. Well, there's an old Irish joke. Excuse me, mate, do you know the way to Tipperary? Oh, well, I sure wouldn't start from here. And you know, I wouldn't start from here given where I'd like to be going. But what's exciting for me about this time is not that everything's going to change in all sorts of positive ways. What's exciting for me about this time is that we're constantly told this story that everything's too big to change, you know, like it's just overwhelming. It's like this monolithic, huge thing. Like, where would you even begin in trying to make a difference? You might as well just keep your head down and, like, you know, watch Netflix. For me, the hope is that radical change is not impossible. Radical change is absolutely inevitable at this point.
Definitely.
Like, there is well, there are two possibilities. Either we change direction or we end up where we're headed. And neither of those look anything like today. No. So radical change is coming. That's the thing. And the story we're all being told is, you can't really change anything, it's all too big. No, radical change is coming. The question is, how's it going to be steered? And it's going to be steered, you know, someone asked me once to sum up the future as I see it in one word, and the word I settled on was diverse. Like, the future is not going to be one thing. Like, for some people, collapse has already happened. For some species, collapse has already happened. For some cultures, collapse has already happened. Like, collapse is not some thing where people are sitting around in some, you know, comfortable podcast saying to each other, well, where's your collapse then, mate? Everything still seems all right to me. You know, I think of it as shrinking circles of affluence. You know, more and more people are falling out of comfort and into desperation. And so it may not be possible to, you know, as an individual, change the course of history. Like, I think that's probably a reasonable conclusion to reach. But can we, in that unfolding context, create things of wild beauty and joy that we're incredibly proud to be part of? Absolutely. And is that actually in some ways getting easier because the top-down powers that be are finding it harder to sustain themselves because a lot of the big infrastructures are crumbling? Well, yeah, like, you know, they might have CCTV cameras on you, but there might not be anyone sitting behind them anymore. You know, like, as big systems fall apart, as cracks open up, we can live in those cracks, and we can widen those cracks, and we can live good lives in those cracks. And, you know, I sometimes go back to, there's a book by Viktor Frankl about literally living in a Nazi concentration camp.
That's for his meaning.
And about finding meaning in that context. And if someone can find meaning whilst literally living in a Nazi concentration camp, who the hell are we to go, oh, it's all too awful, I just can't even. No, like there's so much beauty to create. And doing that, I think, is the best contribution we can make to making the future better than it would otherwise be. Creating places where, like here, you know, we're learning how to rely on each other and rely on nature for its needs, so that this incredibly omnicidal economy that's trashing everything that we love and the future of everybody, as we become less dependent on that economy, the collapse of it ceases to be like, oh my God, you know, the economy is collapsing, what about my pension? And it becomes more like, oh good, you know, their economy is collapsing. Like, that's going to make more room for nature. That's going to make more room for communities. That's going to mean we stop getting hassled by, you know, the local authority. That's going to mean, you know, because the challenges for all the really radical, beautiful places in the world, whether it be the Zapatistas in Mexico or the ZAD in France or Rojava down in Kurdistan, like all these incredibly inspiring examples of people living, I mean, in some ways, as people always lived before this mad little era in human history. The great challenges that they face aren't really getting on with each other, although that's certainly a challenge, or growing food or building houses. The real challenge is that the powers that be turn up and start harassing them or blowing up their buildings, or, you know, making sure that other people don't see examples of people who are able to live without top-down authority. And so in many ways, like, I don't want to paint an overly positive picture of the future, because on the grand scale, I don't really see one. But in terms of how we can choose to live our lives and how we can ground our lives in something profoundly meaningful and joyous and wonderful on a day-to-day level, which also spreads inspiration to others and creates exactly the kinds of infrastructures that we're going to need in order to improve the situation, as, you know, as supermarkets don't feed people anymore, as energy bills become unaffordable, as collapse unfolds in the way that it does. I mean, hell yeah, absolutely we can do it. And as I say, the thing about it is, like, living that way, I mean, god damn, it feels better than watching Netflix. Like, it feels so much better than distracting ourselves from the hollowness, because it ain't there anymore. Like, actually, yeah, I believe in my life, and it's a great feeling. And you know, what could be more therapeutic than that?
Yeah, thank you, powerful words, Shaun. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, that thing about me feeling positive, I think for me, where that comes from is partly looking at trauma over the last 20 years, my own, being in such a dark place. And I guess it's partly the idea of this sovereign archetype creating that vision. You know, it's like seeing that, yeah, that I have yeah, I don't know what it's going to look like. It sounds like you have a clearer vision of what the future will look like, you know, on those two avenues. I don't necessarily, but I have in my mind what I'd like to see more. And I kind of come back to these four ideas that we need: community, four things: community, food, water, and energy, and whatever that is. And I mean, Buckminster Fuller talked about this idea that don't try and fix the old system, just create a new one. And it was like, oh yeah. And kind of, and I guess, you know, being involved in the Mankind Project, or the community I lived in, or even Menfest, this idea, oh yeah, you know, a couple of hundred people, it's like we can do something. So yeah. And that, yeah, so I guess I understand. I almost feel what underpins, from my perspective, the Buddhist teachings of, you know, reflecting on death. I almost feel that one of our struggles in Western culture is this transition of change. We don't want change, and yet change is, like they said, the only constant in the universe. And this feeling that, you know, maybe tomorrow I will die, or the world will die. And having spent time reflecting, meditating on that over the last, say, 15, 20 years, I feel much more, it's like, okay, yeah. So I kind of resonate with what you're saying, although I guess I feel very optimistic. I feel very joyful at the moment. Yeah. So don't know if that's a question or not, but
Oh, I mean, it speaks to me of, as I say, what I call dark optimism. You know, it's this kind of, I don't have to pretend that everything's fine in order to find meaning and purpose and joy. But the process of getting there, I think, is one that involves grief. You know, I think that, you know, I was raised with the idea of, you know, progress, you know, human progress and human ascent towards, I guess, I don't know, Star Trek or some kind of vision of technologically exploring the stars, and realizing that that's completely untethered from reality. Hurt, you know, letting go of that was painful, and recognizing that, oh, I don't think I can prevent this culture from destabilizing our very climate. You know, that hurt, still hurts. And I could have numbed myself to that pain and gone through life less alive as a consequence. But grief holds out the possibility of crying our tears, opening those doors, feeling our pain, and then being like, okay, I can look at this now. What life do I want to live in relation to it? And that for me is the kind of the dark optimism, because, as you say, like, all things move towards their end. All things. So if we make sustainability our god, well, we're opposed to the very way that the universe exists. So if that's not the right aim, what is? And for me, it's, yeah, telling the story with our days that we're proud to tell, and that will look very different to different people, but it certainly doesn't look like living forever, and it certainly doesn't look like this ecocidal, colonial, racist, despicable culture lasting forever. I mean, you know, when I talk about the fact that I'm worried about things like species dying and our climate being destabilized, people often think, right, you're an environmentalist and you're into sustainability. And actually, I don't really identify with either of those things. I think, you know, sustainability, like, firstly, I think it's impossible. Secondly, I think it's undesirable, because I don't want to keep this culture going at all. I want it to end and be replaced with something better. And thirdly, it's downright uninspiring. I mean, there's a late permaculture teacher, Toby Hemingway, who said, you know, if someone asks you how your marriage is going and you say, oh, it's sustainable, it's not great, right? I mean, like, that is not the aim. Like, it implies that I mean, it's slightly better than, oh, we leave a trail of destruction everywhere we go, you know, and there's no way it's possibly going to last more than another 5 minutes. Okay, sustainable is an improvement on that, but surely what we want to be is regenerative and nourishing and joyous. You know, that's what we want our relationships to be, and that's what we want our culture to be. You know, I want to leave things better than I found them, not just keep them alive a bit longer. And so, you know, I think sustainability is such a manky word. I mean, it's useful. I mean, as I say, if you want to keep something going, then sustainability is a good aim, and it's an improvement over unsustainability. But it's a troubling aim. And I think, you know, really what you're talking about with your optimism is, yeah, I do think we need to separate a kind of personal level, kind of active hope and determination from the idea that everything's going to be all right, you know. And yeah, really, in terms of what does that look like, I mean, that, you know, that's what my work's about now. You know, so what inspired me so much on discovering the manuscript for David's great Lean Logic Dictionary for the Future was that it really laid out in a way I'd never seen before the roots of what a life well lived looks like in this context. It really, as someone who'd spent by that time, yeah, like 10, 15 years looking into all this stuff, it really gave me a new lens on what's unfolding and what we might do about it. And then because it's huge and it's in this strange kind of interlinked dictionary format, I struggled to find a publisher for it initially. And so out of that book, I edited this paperback, Surviving the Future, which is a kind of, I think of it as a kind of gateway drug in some ways. You know, it's a more accessible, conventional, read it front to back book, which I kind of, Lean Logic's like a choose your own adventure book, if you like. You go to any entry and it links to lots of other entries and you follow the path of your own interest, and it's got this amazing sort of holistic experience to it. And I might mention as well that a fan of that book also turned it into a website, leanlogic.online, where you can now access the entire full contents of the book for free. And it suits it really well, because in many ways it feels a bit like Wikipedia, I suppose. You know, you sort of read an entry and there are links to others and you can sort of browse your way through it. But nonetheless,
leanlogic.online.
Leanlogic.online, yeah.
Okay.
And it's great because you can kind of read it in bite-sized pieces, but nonetheless, as a book, you know, you look at it and you think, oh, bloody hell, far too big, not even going to go there. I mean, imagine how big Wikipedia would be if you printed it out as a book, you know, but nonetheless, people use it all the time. And so, yeah, Surviving the Future is a kind of a way in a kind of more conventional book format. And really that's, you know, that's what these are. They're a framework for small scale solutions. They're a framework for people finding their path and their meaning. And so are the courses. So out of that and the enthusiasm for the books grew this interest in, well, what would it be like to kind of have a kind of enhanced experience? So there's now an online course called Surviving the Future, A Path Through Tumultuous Times. And it's basically based around this book. So as you go through it, like, it's in 8 modules, and so as you do module 1, you'd read chapter 1, but then alongside that there are talks from people who are doing work inspired by the book, and there's readings that really take it out in new directions or explore things that have happened since David's death. Or there's a community that's built up around these courses. So if you're really interested in something that you're reading, there's forums and you can post there and I'll respond and other people will respond. And it's, again, creating, in another sense, community around these questions, because so many people are in a space where, you know, maybe they learn about some aspect of the global crisis, whether it's, you know, whether it's climate, or whether it's food crisis, or whether it's cultural polarization, or whether it's racism, or, you know, whatever, and they're sort of engaging with that. And then they maybe learn about another and they start to see how they interlink, and then they want to talk to their friends about all this stuff. The problem of wanting to have that dark optimism conversation is that if your friends don't know the dark, then you kind of start by saying, oh, okay, well, let me explain the problem that we face, and then we can talk about what we're going to do about it. But of course, if they don't know about how bad these things are, then you just end up talking about that the whole time, and then they're overloaded, and you become the dark guy, you know, you become the doom guy. And you never get to have the conversation you actually wanted to have, which was, yeah, but how do we respond? Like, how do we respond with hope and positivity to this situation? And so that kind of online community that we've created, I think provides that space. It provides a space where, as you're learning about what we face, here's a bunch of people, you know, they've all read the book before, they all have a sense of where we're at. And we've all for several years been talking to each other about this stuff, and it's like, yeah, come join the conversation, like come have a bit like me at Schumacher College, you know, like find a peer group around this stuff. And it's such a nourishing thing. I think one of the most difficult experiences I've had is kind of feeling alone with the apocalypse. And I think with the internet, a lot of people are there, you know, you can go and you can research stuff on your own and stuff, and I mean, these days it's less of a thing because now there are sort of communities on Reddit and Discord and various places that you can find online to talk to others about this stuff. But certainly when I was looking into all this in the kind of early 2000s, it was really hard to find anyone to talk to about this, and you think, am I going mad? Like, you know, this seems so huge, but like nobody seems to care. And so yeah, the online courses, which you can find if you just googled Stirling College Surviving the Future, you'd find them very easily.
I'll put links to Lean Logic Online, Stirling College in the bottom of the description, so
perfect.
People
so yeah, like the courses are really a space for people to explore the kind of questions you're talking about, like how do we find that meaning and joy and purpose without going into denial. A bit like me after you know, seeing that text wasn't going to be implemented, you know, I felt very clearly there was a pathway there where I could have just kept banging my head against that wall despite knowing it wasn't going anywhere. And I felt clearly there was a path that was like just denial and pretend everything's fine and try and distract myself as all the things I knew were going to happen kept unfolding. But there is another path, and it's better, you know, I can say that because I'm on it. You know, it's really good to look these things in the eye and live in a way that feels appropriate to us, and for some people that will look more like kind of building the alternatives. For some people that will look more like, you know, resisting the destruction. For some people, you know, we all find our personal kind of niche that we're called to. But I think the critical thing is, yeah, falling neither into kind of blind optimism nor despair, and walking that kind of narrow road between the two where all the good stuff happens.
Yeah, thank you. A few ideas there, kind of as lots of tributaries opened up, and then where did they go?
Well, I think lots of them met and came together beautifully.
They did. I just had a couple there. It was like, oh yeah. So one of the things which comes to me is that idea of, I think it's the king archetype, hearing Robert Moore talk about the sovereign, this idea that the king sees that something needs happening, and then rather than waiting for someone else to do it, he steps forward, or she steps forward, right? And I also love what Robert Bly talks about, this idea of where our wound is, that's where our gift is to give to society. And I see that in my work, and I'm really passionate about the boarding school stuff because my boarding school journey was pretty horrific. And therefore, post the healing, the monastery, things like that, now it's like, hey, do you guys not see this? And so, yeah, I really resonate with what you're saying there is, yeah, once we've done the healing, once we've done the grieving, we've come out the other side with the support of a community, find out what is your gift to give.
Yeah. And it's not always that neat either. You know, those two processes are often entangled and entwined. It's not necessarily finish this and then do that, you know, but absolutely. I think everyone who, I don't know, is engaged in meaningful work of one kind or another, they deeply believe in. Everyone has this kind of motivation that they go back to. Like for me, it's the forests. Actually, I grew up around the forest, and I always felt safest and happiest in the forest. And like, if there's one image that encapsulates for me the injustice that I'm against, it's just the, you know, the clear cutting of ancient forests. You know, these incredible beings just being annihilated. And you know, there's so much more than that unfolding in the world, but you know, if there's an image that encapsulates the injustice for me, it's that. For my late fiance Mara, it was seeing when she was a little girl in Pakistan, seeing other little girls begging on the street and just feeling, well, why do I have this and they don't? You know, for her that was always the thing. For you, I think it's, you know, goes back to that boarding school experience and the injustice encapsulated in that. And you know, in many ways each of these is a microcosm of the same macrocosm. You know, we're all looking at the same kind of sick culture, but it's just, you know, that was where we came in, I guess. And yeah, it's really interesting what you talk about with this kind of idea of the wound being our gift, the kind of the wounded healer, because I found after David and Maria had passed on, as a writer, I would write about my grief, and it was only through that and through the responses of readers that I came to see the parallels between that very personal grief and this kind of collective grief that we're all facing and engaging with in some way or other. You know, that wasn't at all clear to me, and so it was, you know, that wound that eventually painfully opened my eyes to the need for and the possibility of, yeah, the kind of work that I do now. Absolutely.
Beautiful, beautiful. So we've kind of probably almost done 2 hours, so I'd love for you just to maybe share, you know, last kind of sentence for people, last paragraph, you know, of I guess last words really to tie this all together.
Yeah, I mean, what comes to mind for me right now is a line from, well, 2 lines actually. One from Howard Thurman, who was a mentor of Martin Luther King's, and he said, "Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive, because what the world needs is people who've come alive." And the reason that stays with me is because I have to remind myself of that so often. I quite often get into what the world needs and get into kind of should, you know, like I should do this because this needs doing. And life has taught me that's not wise. And yeah, that my wounds are a path to my gift, but also my joy is. And joy is a pretty good guide to whether I'm fully alive. And that really is what the world needs. And the other line is from my all-time favorite writer, Wendell Berry, who said, who wrote, "Be joyful, though you have considered all the facts."
Yeah, thank you, Shaun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
It's been a
thank
joy.
you. Really beautiful. Thank you for your conversation. I'm sure I could talk. I've got so many more questions, but we could do a 3-part, but no, I'll
I'm sure we'll talk again sometime.
yeah, and I say this to all my guests: if I can support your work in any way, if you have ideas, or you know, please do reach out. Like I said, if you're in this area, come and visit. You know, lovely to have you come and stay. But yeah, thank you so much, and I'll put in the description links to all your websites: Dark Optimism, Lean Logic, Sterling College. Books, best place to buy them on your website, Dark Optimism.
There's a link there, certainly.
Yeah.
yeah, at darkoptimism.org/books, or if you're after David Fleming's books, I'd say flemingpolicycentre.org.uk/books. I'll put the various links in the chat to save you having to look them up.
Okay.
And yeah, that's probably the best place to look. I'm also on Twitter at darkoptimism. Yeah, I mean, anyone can. I mean, there's links to all the various things I've talked about on my website, darkoptimism.org. So people can certainly find their way if for some reason they're listening to this in a place where they can't see the description underneath.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Shaun. And yeah, amazing work. And yeah, definitely learned a lot today. So thank you.
Thank you, man. I'll speak to you again soon, I hope.
Okay. Take care.